Good morning, everybody. This will be my last video discussion of the readings. We're going to look at Battiste and Grande's essays today. I'll talk about them more or less separately, although there is some overlap between their arguments. I will also provide a very brief review that focuses on issues of the meaning of education as a practice of cognitive freedom. I'll try and gather my thoughts over the rest of the week and post that on the weekend or early next week. It might prove useful for the final exam. And I've also been working on the exam question. It's taking shape, and I hope to post that maybe tomorrow. If not tomorrow, certainly Thursday at the latest. That will give everyone a lot of time to think it through and to begin sketching out an approach and to get in touch with me and pose any questions if you should have them. So before we get into Battiste and Grande's essays, let me remind everybody of some comments that Dewey made, and I glossed over them. I didn't spend a lot of time discussing them precisely because I wanted to look at them from the perspective of Indigenous people defining and defending their own traditions, their own forms of knowledge, and their own forms of life. But those comments of Dewey's, and they weren't untypical, or so rather they weren't atypical for even progressive thinkers at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, is to regard Indigenous peoples as, to use his word, savages, right? Closer to the animal kingdom than to what Dewey regarded as the scientific and progressive and dynamic social forms of early 20th century life. His point with regard to education was that Indigenous societies simply reproduce themselves. Right? Whatever knowledge defines Indigenous societies, it's rather more like the instinctual knowledge of animals than it is the abstract scientific knowledge of progressive industrial societies. I didn't comment critically at the time, although I did flag it, because I thought it best to let Indigenous scholars speak in their own name, and that is what we get in the last two essays that we're reading together. First of all, Battiste's kind of history of, on the one hand, the colonial university, but also on the other, different treaty and constitutional obligations which anchor the need of the Canadian state to respond to that colonial history by indigenizing the university, by decolonizing curriculum, and most importantly, ensuring that the demographics of the university are changed, that more Indigenous scholars are hired, that more Indigenous students are recruited, and that this has an impact on the form and content of education. There's also some tensions that she notes, and I'll come back to that in a second. Grande's, Grande or Grande, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. There's no accent aigu, so I'm thinking Grande, but if I mispronounce it, I apologize. Sandy Grande's essay is more deeply critical of the university. It offers a kind of more challenging philosophical critique and raises the issue that we've talked about from another perspective of whether and to what extent all knowledge is a social construction. I'm going to focus on that issue when I get to that essay, but I want to focus on it in the particular context of the political argument that Grande makes, which is that Indigenous people, racialized people, rather than seeking recognition within the institution, ought to refuse it, and what that might mean. There's some ambiguity, political and philosophical. But to begin with, right, when we think of Dewey's comments, right, which treats Indigenous societies as simple, as devoted only to reproduction and survival, we can see very clearly why, when we shift perspective and look at something like Dewey's argument from an Indigenous perspective, it clearly bears all the hallmarks of a colonial attitude. If a society is simply reproducing itself and not contributing anything to a global store of knowledge from Dewey's perspective, then its assimilation or transformation is actually a good thing, right? That is the whole justifying idea of colonialism, is that it's a good thing to be colonized. Think of the residential school system and the way it was justified, right? We are civilizing the indigenous people, right? We are giving them the gift of European knowledge, giving them the gift of Christianity, science, etc., and so forth. But what you're actually doing, when we look at it from the standpoint of the people who were colonized, is destroying their ways of life that had their own integrity and complex systems of knowledge which were not recognized from within the colonial framework. So when you look at indigenous systems of knowledge from the perspective of European science and philosophy, it might look as though there's no complexity or richness, but that's only because you can't see it from the framework with which you look at it. Indigenizing the curriculum, decolonizing the curriculum, indigenizing the university from Battiste's perspective can go one of two ways. She begins by noting the danger, right? There's a danger that universities pay lip service and governments pay lip service to indigenization simply to attract more indigenous students and increase the bottom line of the university. This is a kind of tokenistic strategy that doesn't that makes gestures towards institutional changes only for the sake, really, of perpetuating the institution as it has been. And so it's not a challenge to assimilation or colonialism. It's simply a tactic to perpetuate it. On the other hand, if the university makes a serious effort to live up to its historical commitments that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada reminded everybody of, but which there are constitutional and treaty grounds. She goes through those constitutional and treaty grounds in quite a bit of detail. I don't think I need to repeat what she says. It's fairly straightforward, and certainly all of us should be familiarizing ourselves, with those treaty obligations and those constitutional commitments. Right? We don't think of it very often. A very close Indigenous friend of mine reminds me, right? You're you're a treaty person too, right? The relationship between settlers and the Indigenous nations is supposed to be structured by the treaties, nation-to-nation treaties that were signed, right? But of course, the Canadian state has historically ignored those treaties. So Battiste reminds us of those obligations in general and anchors her calls for change in constitutional principles and treaty commitments. But from the standpoint of the university, indigenization and decolonization, she maintains, has to mean more than PR tactics and a few tokenistic hires and perhaps a land recognition at the beginning of meetings. It has to mean a commitment to actually hiring Indigenous scholars and recruiting Indigenous students, and then changing in response to not only the content of curricula, but the way things are taught. She doesn't go into details about different Indigenous epistemologies and different Indigenous traditions, although she reminds us, and it's useful to remind us, that Indigenous is an abstract catch-all term, right? Indigenous people aren't Indigenous, they are Potawatomi or Mohawk, etc., and so forth. And each of those nations has their own traditions and their own ways of knowing. But we can say that, in broad terms, those ways of knowing differ from at least certain European traditions. They are place-based. They are grounded in deep practical knowledge of the local community. They emphasize connection. They're holistic, she says. So if universities are committed to overcoming colonialism, overcoming the racist stereotypes with which Indigenous people have been painted over the years, the way their knowledge has been ignored, as knowledge, then it has to affect not only the content, right? Not only allowing Canadian history to be studied from an Indigenous perspective, which it has to be, right? If it's not, then we're not getting a comprehensive perspective on our own history. We're not getting a true history. But the university also has to change the way in which teaching is approached, right? More collaborative, more democratic, more inclusive. Now, that's not exclusively an Indigenous priority. We've seen Freire make similar arguments, but on the other hand, Freire came to those insights working with peasants, many of whom would be Indigenous in Chile, and then later around the world in Guinea-Bissau and Africa. So I suppose to sum up Battiste's argument, we have to learn, right? Those of us coming from a perspective, a Eurocentric perspective on the academy, on the university, on what knowledge is, we have to learn that we have things to learn. But this raises a more challenging philosophical issue, which goes right to the heart of Sandy Grande's essay, which is the extent to which all knowledge as preserved and developed within the university is Eurocentric and racialized, to use a term that Grande employs, is a social construction or a sociocultural construction. And here, without denying that there is a colonial history to the university, obviously there is, right? The first Canadian universities, U of T, McGill, were consciously modeled on the English model, on Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, England was the major colonial power across the world, and one of the two major colonial powers that colonized what we call Canada. Okay, that's fine. There is that obvious historical connection between the university and colonialism. There's also clearly, as Battiste also uncovered, a connection between a Eurocentric self-understanding of what knowledge is and a systematic, centuries-long attack on and attempt to destroy Indigenous ways of knowing. And again, Dewey expresses that. The Indigenous people have nothing to teach us. Their societies are simple, traditional reproductive systems. Just knowledge of how to survive is passed on from generation to generation. There's no cognitive growth, and therefore nothing to teach a dynamic society. I think, to be sure, Indigenous resistance to that type of racist and colonial construction has uncovered what might not seem obvious, right? We tend to think of education as a value, as a need, as a practice of cognitive freedom, as I've been arguing. But when it's practiced against communities who are constructed or positioned as not knowing anything or not knowing what we know, therefore not knowing anything, education can be a harm. It's not really education in that sense, is it? It's domination and cultural destruction. That's the institutional history, and it touches upon what counts as knowledge. But does it determine the object of knowledge? To what extent is scientific or philosophical knowledge culturally constructed? Yes, natural science depends upon a certain worldview. It depends upon trust in quantified methods. But aren't those methods justified, at least in one dimension of our experience and reality, by the fact that they have predictive success? That's not to say that, contemporary physics is the ultimate truth, the one and only one perspective on reality, a God's eye view, so to speak. Right? There are embedded, local, practical forms of scientific knowledge. Right? That's what I think Battiste is talking about when she talks about Indigenous epistemologies and ways of knowing. Right? But at the same time, if the argument that all knowledge in the university is racialized or Eurocentric means that the electron is simply a posit of a Eurocentric racist worldview, right, that would seem to me to be philosophically problematic and indefensible. Right? An electron is not just some thing, right? It's part of a complex, interconnected web of explanation that allows us to do things like generate power, build computers and transmission networks. The computer, as we've talked about before, relies upon logic and logical systems, which if they weren't, if the rules didn't work, or if they were just arbitrarily made up from one particular perspective, it's hard to explain how computers work, whether they work in our classroom or in Beijing or in Western Africa. They work the same place all over the place. Moreover, what we call natural science is today a global enterprise drawing on minds from many, many different cultures, right? And so I simply say I'm not quite certain what it means to assert baldly that all knowledge is racialized, right? Of course, what counts as knowledge has been racialized. Other ways of knowing have been ignored for racist reasons. But I think there are certain ways of knowing which prove their universality by the very fact that they draw in people from all kinds of cultures, right? Certainly, science is not the preserve of white people anymore, right? Even if in the Enlightenment, white people, European people, flattered themselves that they were the only ones to have the truth and everyone else had to learn from them or get out of the way, at this point in history, that's certainly not true. So what's being criticized? Is it a way of institutionalizing knowledge, which I think is legitimate to criticize, or is the claim more ontologically radical, that there is no reality out there save various cultural constructions? That I find more problematic, right? And I've mentioned the reasons why I find that problematic in other discussions. I want to turn, by way of conclusion, to Grande's political claim that because the university is a colonial institution and therefore structured by the racist forces that drove colonialism, it should be refused that African American students, indigenous students should refuse the university. I think that we have to interpret that claim in the context of her criticisms of the politics of recognition. And she draws here on the arguments of Glenn Sean Colthart, who's a Dene political theorist and activist, teaches at the University of Victoria, drawing on his arguments from a book which I highly recommend called Red Skin, White Masks. I won't get into all the details, but the core argument for our purposes is that the politics of recognition, whereby a racist and colonial past is acknowledged and the legitimacy of the perspectives of the colonized is accepted, can be a tactic by which colonial power relations are perpetuated. Because if there is a power imbalance between me and you, just to simplify the argument, right, and I have more power and I recognize you, well, that can also be a way of emphasizing my power, right? Oh, yes, I know you have a perspective, and I'm going to listen to it. But if nothing else changes, if the material and social structures that cause me to have more power than you aren't addressed, then my acknowledgement, my recognition can at the same time be a recognition of your relative powerlessness. So Grande's argument is that, moves towards indigenization, to hiring a few indigenous professors or to recruiting more indigenous students, that can fail as a means of historically redressing the legacy and the actuality of the ongoing actuality of colonialism, if it is not part and parcel of much broader struggles against racist structures, against exploitative structures, alienated structures. And I accept that. You don't have to, or you might. I accept that part of the argument. Of course, there are profoundly damaging colonial relationships that still exist. We've talked about the Wet'suwet'en struggle on many occasions. We could give other examples, right? And that's a bigger project, right? And certainly nothing that happens in the university on its own, disconnected from broader social struggles, is going to be able to address that. But what about refusing the university, right? And here I think, in trying to understand what that means, I think Grande has two tactics. There are two implications, and I'm not sure exactly how they fit together. And I don't want to speak for the author, but so I'll just discuss my reading of it without claiming that my reading is necessarily the correct one. So, on the one hand, by refusing the university, I think Grande means that Indigenous people, racialized people, other oppressed people have to be wary of being seduced by promises from the administration, from governments, but also from senior academics like me who are invested in the institutional structure, whether they want to be or not. They have to be suspicious that, oh yes, we acknowledge the problems, and now we're going to move forward. We're going to hire Indigenous professors, etc., and so forth. Right? Refusing that sort of recognition means demanding more. Right? Demanding depth transformations where other forms of historically excluded knowledge are actually allowed to be freely disseminated, where different pedagogical practices and so forth are genuinely embraced in a way that transforms the institution. But on the other hand, towards the end of the paper, Grande also argues that the university should be refused in a quite literal sense, that, at least to some extent, oppressed people should withdraw from them to create their own, what I think she calls them, safe spaces, right? Where their own traditions can be practiced, where they can have their own types of conversations, make their own criticisms, apart from the university institution. Now that can mean one of two things as well. I think on the one hand, that's a great idea. Not everything about education not every goal of education can be achieved within the university. We have to think for ourselves. Sometimes we might need to constitute our own spaces, especially if we're members of historically oppressed groups, right? And we can educate ourselves. There are long traditions of popular education. Freire, although he has become a hero of critical educators in universities, wasn't a university professor, right? He developed his methods in popular education. He when he came to the States, he worked with Miles Horton, who ran the Highlander School, which I've mentioned before. Mireille and I talk about it. Right? They were popular educators. They were also deeply suspicious of the institution, precisely because there's so much political and economic interference in the university. So there's always good reasons to withdraw from it. However, and maybe this is the philosophy professor talking, right? Nevertheless, I think that the university, while it's a contradictory space, nevertheless remains a space where genuine education can occur. And here I go back to bell hooks, right? And this would be a very interesting comparison, right? If we were together talking, right? Hooks makes many similar arguments to Grande and Battiste, right? She also argues that the university is deeply implicated in racist and sexist social structures and histories. But she doesn't call for racialized people to withdraw from the academy, but to sit at the table and demand that it change. Right? And in particular, in the classroom. Hooke's crucial argument was that the classroom cannot be a safe space. It has to be a space of risk and conflict. People have to make the hard arguments. Racism has to be called out, and it has to be acknowledged. And that's the only way we will be able to change it. So if historically oppressed people were to literally refuse the university wouldn't disappear, but it would carry on without challenge. That's a potential downside. Right? If there are problems with the university, right, problems which could be corrected if it were challenged by a broad-based coalition of oppressed groups and those standing in solidarity with them, wouldn't that lead to a university that is more like a university, that actually represented and cultivated the universe of human understanding and creativity? So, I mean, it's not for me to define what oppressed people do, and nor would I presume to tell them. However, when people write papers, respect for them as intellectuals